Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Google, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Netflix, and so on. All of these websites are visited by countless people across the world every day, and none of them are European.
Doesn't seem to matter what I do, I'm always number two.
But on all of them, you have to accept or reject your cookies every time you visit the site for the first time. So it's a win for European values in the end, right? Content with having none of the economic benefits associated with owning some of the best tech companies in the world, but the satisfaction of regulating other countries' tech companies, the EU is making the exact same mistakes it did in the .com era, but now in the AI era. Today I want to talk about why Europe is falling so far behind the US economically and why its excessive regulation is killing the domestic technology sector in the continent. Back in 2008, the EU economy was actually larger than the American one. But 16 years on, the US grew its GDP by nearly 70%, whereas the EU plus the UK combined grew its economy by around 22%. Because the EU has a much larger population than the US, when you work out the GDP per capita for the US and the EU, the average American produces nearly twice as much economic output as the average European. These figures are pretty shocking when you consider it's meant to be easier for you to grow your economy if you're starting from a lower base. Think developing countries versus developed countries, they grow at a higher rate. But the EU has somehow managed to have far slower economic growth than the US, despite being poorer on average. Much of this has been driven by the tech sector. It's unquestionable that the tech sector has driven much of global growth over the last 15 years or so. And if that is the case, has Europe finally caught on and decided to spend more money on tech? Well, no, the US still spends 5 times as much on tech R&D as Europe and 50 times as much on AI R&D. So the EU appears to be falling further behind yet again. But why aren't companies in Europe willing to spend more money on technology R&D? I mean, surely it would be rewarding for them profits-wise in the long term. Well, there's a whole host of reasons, and primarily among them is regulation. Take employment law regulation. The EU is well known worldwide for being one of the best places to work in the world for employees. But once an employee has been hired, it's extremely difficult to get rid of them, even if they're underperforming or if they're paid a huge amount of money by their company. It doesn't matter. Take this recent case in Frankfurt where a banker on 375,000 euros per year was fired by Morgan Stanley. After Brexit, the EU mandated that key decision makers at banks operating in the EU should be moved from London to European headquarters, like Frankfurt, for example. In order to sweeten the deal, due to German employment law making it really difficult to fire anyone, they introduced a new law saying that key decision makers could be let go of at a shorter notice than usual. But when the man was fired, he alleged to the courts that he actually didn't have the role that his job title implied he did. He wasn't a material risk taker, and the actual key decision maker was still in London. Morgan Stanley had only created the role to artificially satisfy the regulations by the EU Central Bank, saying central decision makers should be in Europe. Because of this, the judge agreed with him that he shouldn't have been fired as he wasn't a material risk taker, despite him having the job title of one and the pay of one, 375,000 euros. It's in this environment that European companies find it really difficult to be dynamic like US ones when they don't know how hard it will be for them to get rid of people if an investment doesn't turn out well. Take the case of the crisis in tech at the end of 2022 or the beginning of 2023. Major big tech companies like Microsoft, Google, and Meta all had to lay off thousands of employees. That allowed them to redeploy cash and capital into new features like AI spend. In America, this is relatively trivial, as at-will employment means employers can hire and fire employees without having to pay any compensation at a moment's notice. but in these cases, they did tend to pay out a few months of pay to their employees as a sign of goodwill. However, for these American companies, when it came to their European employees, of which they had a small percentage, they found it extremely difficult to get rid of them. In many cases, they actually had to resort to offering a 1-year compensation package of employees' pay to them in order to bribe them to resign effectively. Conversely, many European tech companies that have almost all of their employees within Europe are having a much tougher time. They announced layoff plans at a similar time to the American big tech companies early 2023, but are still trying to get rid of their employees and have to wait until 2026 until their restructuring plans can be fully implemented due to employment law. Because of that, these European companies like SAP, Europe's biggest software company, can only invest around 500 million euros per year into AI compared to the tens of billions that Meta, Google, and Microsoft are investing. One potential compromise that would preserve the European social model whilst also allowing for more dynamism within the tech sector would be to relax employment laws for employees who earn above a very high threshold of salary. But if the case of the Morgan Stanley banker is anything to go by, maybe that won't be enough. Another problem with excessive regulation is that it makes it really difficult for startups and small companies to pay for the cost of complying with them. If you're a startup in the US, you can basically grow your business to a certain size without having to worry about the EU's regulation at all. Once you're a huge company and able to go multinational, then you can start to worry about complying with these regulations. And by then, it's pretty easy because you have absolutely loads of money to do so. Whereas if you're a small European company, you have to develop your product with these regulations from the start, which means it's much more inefficient and you're going to be outcompeted by the US multinational when they come to your home turf. Not content with simply defining what a company is allowed to charge for its product, see Apple and the Apple App Store, the EU has now decided to release the AI Act. This is an act which pretty much invents a bunch of uses for AI that haven't been created yet and basically regulates what they can and can't do before they've been created. Now, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, has bitterly complained about this act already as he believes it will damage the hopes of French startups, which are only at a very small stage, especially when you compare them to US and Chinese counterparts. Europe's approach to technology and business can be summed up as it being extremely risk averse, and as we see with investing, if you take zero risk, then you'll get zero returns. And if you take minimal risk, then you'll probably get minimal returns. And that's what we've seen with the European economy. Not only is it limited to technology though, it's also in finance, the main sector that pretty much pays for technology to be developed. It's very underdeveloped in Europe. European companies are almost entirely dependent on the United States capital markets in order to fund research and development and capital investments into new technologies. This means that new startups that have been nurtured and perhaps receive government subsidies in the EU in order to proliferate can easily be acquired by American private equity groups or tech giants, so America reaps the profits of European investment, which is smaller anyway. European individuals tend to be a lot more conservative with their savings than Americans. They keep most of their money in cash, which is a non-productive asset, and don't invest their money into stocks and shares, which actually allow for productive enterprises to grow and the overall economy to grow as well. This actually leads to a vicious cycle where American companies tend to expand at a much faster pace and look more attractive as an investment, which means that the European investors who do want to invest end up sinking their cash into American companies, which allows them to grow quicker and so on. If Europe wants to prevent itself from becoming effectively technologically colonized by the Chinese and the Americans over the next century, it's gonna need an absolutely monumental shift in mindset. And I'm not sure that the continent is capable of doing that, considering it's still going in the complete opposite direction of that right now with the AI Act. the continent will require an absolute shift in mindset when it comes to risk aversion and encouraging people to invest more money into stocks and shares and take risks with their savings. In addition to that, they're going to have to stop feeding the worst of their tendencies to over-regulate. I don't see it changing, and I see things getting even worse for the EU technologically and economically. But of course, I could be wrong. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I will try to reply to the comments. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.